So first off, the school district's central administrative functions, what we call central office, has moved from place to place over many years. And generally, these locations have been somewhat opportunistic in repurposed space, never really designed or constructed for such a purpose. This was the case with central office moved to Parkhurst in 2013, and years prior, its occupancy of a portion of the Lynch Elementary School. And in the 1970s and the early 80s, as some of you know, our team was actually housed at the Sanborn House on the Ambrose campus, which today is the home to the Winchester Historical Society. The only purpose-built location I'm aware of is actually a space long since outgrown. That's Town Hall. If you're up at the select board meeting in the evenings, you'll find a vintage floor plan on the wall, and you'll find that there was space for the school committee and superintendent adjacent to where the select board meets today. But that's been out of service since probably the 1890s. So, to think about central office location strategically back in 2012. At that time, we had just redistricted our elementary schools in preparation for the opening of the new and expanded Vincent Owen. In the decade from 2003 to 2012, statewide K-12 enrollment fell by more than 3%, but in Winchester, our enrollment grew by nearly 30%. We were literally bursting at the seams and in great need for instructional and support spaces. So in addition to the newly expanded Vincent Owen, the school committee saw the need to recapture instructional space at Lynch by moving central office someplace else. And it was at this time that the Carriage House came into some consideration. Built in 1908 following the construction of the main Sanborn House, the Carriage House was, as it is today, school department property under the control of the school committee. This historic accessory building to the Sanborn House had many years prior been gutted of all historic interior fixtures, furnishings, hardware, and so on, to become a rental property that was last leased to a preschool for the 94-95 school year. The building had some appeal to the school department given its adjacency to the Ambrose School and the opportunity to run district professional development there on our non-school PD days. But remember, this was 2012, and we were growing fast. With students seemingly parachuting into the district each day, we needed to find a home for central office quickly. A Carriage House solution would require more discussion, consensus, and study, and of course, funding. So in early 2013, it was determined that central office would relocate from Lynch to Parkhurst. Once one of Winchester's 10 smaller neighborhood elementary schools in the 1950s and well into the 1970s, Parkhurst had been used as swing space for the construction of the new Ambrose School from 2004 to 2006, and once again was pulled out of mothballs to accommodate our Vincent Owen students in 2011 through 2013 during the construction of that new school. With Parkhurst becoming vacant with students moving to the new VO, central office moved into Parkhurst in the summer of 2013, but with some important acknowledgments and conditions made to the town. At approximately 28,000 square feet, Parkhurst is very similar in size and configuration to the Mystic School at Sims Corner, for those who may be more familiar with that physical plant. There was concern expressed by the Finance Committee, town meeting members, and others over a relatively modest space need taking over the entire upper floor of an elementary school, given the cost of utilities and ongoing maintenance. The school committee pledged that the central office move to Parkhurst would not be a long-term solution. We indicated at the time that we would need the space for at least 3 years, but hopefully not more than 10. And the school committee also acknowledged that an update to the district's 10-year facilities master plan was coming on the horizon, and we committed to including this in a study of multiple options for a central office permanent home. Begun in 2016, the master plan indeed looked carefully at the central office question, tying up large spaces not needed and potentially useful to accommodate enrollment growth or swing space for future construction. Parkhurst was once again reaffirmed as a shorter-term solution for our administrative team. The master plan considered several options, including renting space in town and the inclusion in a new Morocco or a new Lynch elementary school. In the summer of 17, the school committee voted to approve the Carriage House option. At a very high level, the Carriage House seemed to be a good fit for our administrative needs, but it was recognized at the time that more work would be required to confirm the fit, the cost, and the timeliness of this solution. The school committee understood at the time, as it does today, that any option to include central office in a new Lynch or Morocco Elementary School project is one worth understanding and seriously considering. In the spring of 18, town meeting approved Article 24, a recommendation from the Capital Planning Committee for space programming and schematic design of central office located at a renovated Carriage House. This work was approved for advertisement by Town Hall in 2020, and we were pleased to select TAPE architects for the project. TAPE is familiar with Winchester, as they are the architects of the Ambrose and the Vincent Owen elementary schools. As I mentioned a moment ago, one consideration for the school committee is whether to seek central office space at the new Lynch Elementary School, which is now in the earliest phases of feasibility study with our partners at the Massachusetts School Building Authority, or MSBA. In some instances, the state does permit districts to include central office program in MSBA projects. However, they make this determination only on a case-by-case basis, and in every instance, the costs are not reimbursable to the district. You'll hear more about a Lynch option in the presentation, but the MSBA has cautioned us explicitly not to expect a decision on allowing central office at a new Lynch until September of 2022. Therefore, in addition to the development of a functional space program for central office and a carriage house design, TAPE was further charged with evaluating the challenges and opportunities associated with both options, including the timeliness, construction cost comparisons, and some operational impacts. As the school committee has been aware for some time, a decision on central office location is needed by October. And this comes from our Lynch Project OPM team. The manager is Hill International, who is with us this afternoon. Although there are inherent challenges in comparing a schematic design option of one solution with a detailed cost estimate to a more conceptual design from the master plan, the goal was to bring enough information and resources to the school committee so as to vote on a direction by the end of the month. TAPE can speak to what work lies ahead in a carriage house solution, while the Hill team is prepared to share some insight into key issues at Lynch. And with that, I want to introduce representatives from TAPE, architects. We have Charlie Hay and Cesar Dedios with us to walk through their presentation. And I'm also pleased that joining us in the audience are two representatives from Hill International. These are the OPM team. And Andy Vo. Vivian is the project director. Andy is the project manager. We'll all be seeing much more of them in the coming 2 or 3 years. We're still in the early phases of assembling the design team for Lynch. I get to see them almost on a weekly basis, but we're all going to start to see more and more of them. I really appreciate their engagement on the Lynch project. So with that quick overview, I'm pleased to turn it over to Charlie or Cesar to walk you through their presentation.
Hi, sorry, hopefully that's the end of the technology difficulties. My name is Charlie Hay. Thank you, Chris, for the kind introduction. And as Chris mentioned, Cesar is here as well. So we are delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting us. And happy to kind of share information about this study with you. We think the Carriage House is a really interesting project. So I'm going to go very quickly through this study. You're getting the sort of the Cliff Notes. Well, the Cliff Notes is not the right turn of phrase to use in a high school. But anyway, the Reader's Digest version of this study. And as Chris has already kind of introduced to you, we were really charged with a process that included developing a space program that is effectively interchangeable between the Lynch site and the Carriage House. And doing a fairly thorough existing conditions investigation of the Carriage House, as well as developing a schematic solution that accommodated the program. And then looking at cost and timeline, and then at least delving into some of the issues around Lynch versus Carriage House. But as Chris said, of course, we've not been charged with any detailed study of the Lynch School site. You are about to embark on that. You're engaged in hiring an architect. So there's only so much we could do there, but there are, I think, some fundamental truths that sort of rise when you look at in depth at this kind of challenge two spots. So with existing conditions, we had a full team of engineers go through the building. We went through the building. We actually Cesar did some destructive testing of the envelope. So we have a pretty thorough understanding of the Carriage House. We had multiple meetings to review the program with the district. And we did ultimately do a detailed, relatively, as Chris said, a relatively detailed estimate of the proposal. So the existing conditions, here's our Carriage House, you all know it. And people may sort of sigh and think, oh my, look at that thing. But we think it's full of opportunities and full of, you know, we think it's worth saving. And essentially what our kind of scheme does and what the reports talk about is really keeping the historic facade intact, restoring, you know, obviously all new fenestration, restoring woodwork where required, and, you know, insulating the envelope, which is not insulated now, and replacing the roof. That picture on the left is part of the roof. So we got moss growing up there, so you know that there are concerns. And there's been a lot of water penetration over the years. And obviously the interiors are in rough shape. There may not be much to be salvaged on the interior. Perhaps there's a modest amount, but generally speaking, it would be a gut renovation of this building. But we think that's possible. And obviously you would insert entirely new systems, including a sprinkler system, so you have fire protection. We can install high efficiency mechanical system that's electric. And really redo the envelope and the interior. So that was kind of the findings around the much more extensive study of the building itself. And then we developed a space program with the district, and that was a multiple meeting effort. And you know, the space program defines the need, so you don't do the design without the need defined. And we came up with a program that's about 8,100 gross square feet. Gross square feet is the overall size, right? So that includes bathrooms, and it includes corridors, it includes wall thicknesses, while net includes the actual spaces themselves. And there's the space program up there, and we're not going to squint our eyes and go into it in any detail, but it does in fact even assign people to locations. So this is fairly thorough, and it does, we think, satisfy sort of the test that, that we were accommodating all the needs of the district. And so this is how we came up with our 8,100 square feet of gross. And the only other thing I say is, which is not in a program, is of course the central offices would require dedicated parking. And that's going to be applicable at either the Lynch or the Carriage House. We realized when we developed this that the Carriage House would only accommodate the program with an addition. So its current configuration is not large enough, but with a fairly modest addition, we can accommodate this 8,100 square feet. So we developed from that process a conceptual design. And we looked at the site, and this you probably all recognize, and if I can maybe pull out a laser pointer and point at it, I will. So there's the Ambrose, here is the Sanborn, and here's our Carriage House. And the site plan that was developed includes retaining the parking lot we already have, and then adding another parking lot that essentially doubles the number of spaces a little bit down the hill, and then relocating the community garden to below that. And the next slide shows in greater detail that section of the site, but there is in place, the town has with the Historic Society and the Sanborn House a long-term lease that defines parcels. And the historic landscape parcel around the Sanborn is here. This is also defined as historic landscape. This was defined as a parcel that the town could use potentially for something like parking. So this plan tries to accommodate the way that the was divided up. And this was reviewed with members of the Historic Society. There was another option that was shown in the master plan from a number of years ago that actually placed parking in front of the Sanborn. That's seen as much less desirable. So this was the preferred option for the site as we sort of proceeded. That is a more detailed look at that. There was also an interest in at least looking at, gee, do we want another curb cut? Should this facility have a separate way in and out? That's, in our view, almost impossible to accomplish on High Street because of the difference in grade. But the reality is we're talking about 20 plus cars coming in and out of here in terms of central office. And we're talking about staggered start and end. So it isn't as if there's any real reason to believe that traffic around the central offices is going to conflict in any dramatic way with pickup and drop off at the Ambrose. So we then looked at the building, and this slide shows you the existing basement. And as many of you know, the existing basement does have a grade access with a kind of grassy ramp that goes up. This also is a demolition drawing, so it's showing the part of the building that we would be, and you'll see this on all three floors, the part of the building that would be removed to accommodate the new design. And then this is the proposed basement level. So this shows you, this is essentially mostly, a lot of it is mechanical and storage. It fulfills the needs of central office for storage. And as we talked about fairly extensively in these meetings, records are becoming more and more digital anyway. However, we are making provision for that. But the one nice feature of the basement is it allows us to get a rather large conference room in there that can be used for bigger meetings. There's a smaller conference room upstairs, but this is a pretty good place to put a room that's big enough to house, 12, 14, 16 people. And it has, paper storage, etc. The main floor is here, and it is shaped, as you probably know, with two wings, and then the main portion of the building in the center, and then a wing in the rear, and then a low concrete CMU addition that is certainly not historical and would, under any circumstances with a restoration renovation, be removed. So we are proposing removing it. We also, and you'll see why in a minute, are proposing removing the northerly, this is the northerly wing of this building in order to allow us to put a second story, having a two-story addition on that side instead of a single-story addition. And the major design impetus for that is that in terms of views from the Ambrose, from the Sanborn House, from High Street, it's relatively hidden back here near the tree line. It may be somewhat serendipitous, but this is also the portion of the building that is most damaged by water infiltration. It has the worst roof. And if we were going to elect to take a part of the building off, this would most certainly be it in terms of its existing conditions. So this is kind of win-win, we think. And the main floor, the ground floor, and you enter through the big arch in the front, where the parking is. And you enter into what we're calling a welcome center, but it's a small lobby. It's not very grandiose, but it's enough if somebody can sit on a bench there. There's the opportunity to have a kind of a transaction desk where someone can greet you. You come, you're a parent, you have a question, you're a vendor, you need to meet with somebody, et cetera, et cetera. So there's the ability to have a kind of forward-facing layout for central offices here. The way offices work now is kind of mimicked here with a lot of administrative assistants in a pool here that any of them who can greet somebody. Superintendent gets a nice large office that also has, one of the things in the brief was the possibility of having a separate entrance exit for that office, which we can accommodate through using one of the, there's 3 doors across the front. And our addition now is a 2-story addition on the northerly side, as I described. And by putting it over here and putting vertical circulation, elevator, stair in it, as well as bathrooms, we can, A, avoid putting those into the historic piece, which is hard because you have to put big holes in the floor for elevators and pipes for plumbing for bathrooms and, you know, a big hole for stair. And it allows us to kind of have those stacking functions in the new construction, which makes a whole lot of sense, and really preserve this historic piece for these offices. And the offices are really laid out the way they are now at the Parkhurst, a lot of them, with pairs of people in some of them. They're, I think, adequate for the use. They're not entire classrooms. So, so it's nice to have an 800 square foot office, but it's not necessarily necessary. So we think these are comfortable sized. You know, 250 square feet is certainly enough space for 2 people. So we think this lays out pretty well. The second floor is the smallest floor, and that is that central pavilion of this Beaux-Arts building only. And you can see the removal of those other pieces around it. The second floor has that same stacking core to the north, which is our addition. It has you know, multiple offices, and again, a sort of central pool. And so again, if somebody comes and arrives at the top of the stairs, somebody can greet them, direct them to where they need to go. We think it's a layout that really will, you know, emphasize collegiality and teaming. And we tried as much as we could to put, you know, glass in the walls so there's some transparency. And I think it could be a very pleasant place to work. That is kind of a conceptual image of the exterior. Hard to believe, right? No vines, no nothing, but you know, I think you could get there. And if you did, it would be pretty exciting. It's a lovely building. And that shows you that main entrance at the archway in front of the parking. And that's an axonometric that shows you the overall massing. And that's where you see this addition to the north. It's set back so that if you're standing here, you at least see the suggestion of that one-story building as it used to be. However, we've accommodated that second floor up here to allow us to have enough space. But again, it's in the back, effectively, in terms of the views. So when you arrive, you don't see it, etc. This is the first floor, sort of with the walls in it. And again, you can see that kind of lobby space, that welcoming space. And then there's the second floor. And again, you can see coming up the stair and having a kind of central area here. I think the offices will have adequate windows. And it's a very efficient layout, let's say. Unlike the Parkhurst now, which is a little bit of walking down a whole lot of hallways, right? And so here's a view of the lobby. So that's what you'd see when you arrived with your stair to your left with that transaction counter I talked about in front of you. Somebody can step up and greet you. You can fill out paperwork if you need to. I mean, most of it's all online now, but nonetheless, that interaction is possible. From behind the transaction counter looking back out at the parking lot. Again, the hope is that folks who are working in these common areas as administrative assistants will have the ability to see what's going on. Nothing is hidden. The sight lines are quite good. And then that's sort of the top of the stairs as you climb up that interior stair. The right hand, that's just kind of a what-if graphic, but we were thinking that's a big old wall. Maybe you could put a map of the town with the schools on it or some such, but it's really, this is a conceptual design only. But it seems like there are opportunities there. So we took that design, which we actually developed a series of drawings around it, and we sent it to our estimator, PM&C, who's, we believe, about the best in the business, and asked them to develop as detailed as they could, and it's still a conceptual design, but as detailed as they could estimate, which they did for us. And we came up with a construction estimate of building and sort of associated site work of about $4.3 million. Then that new parking area that I told you about is about 220. And there is a construction contingency, of course, inserted, as there always is on projects like this. We have 8% here. And then we took a stab at what soft costs are. And soft costs are, as many of you know, are the typical costs around professional fees and furnishings and technology and the kind of things that aren't in the construction cost itself, with some contingency there as well. And we have a overall project cost of about $5.9 million. We then talked about timeline, and this reflects what Chris mentioned in his introduction, the idea that this could move forward sooner rather than later if funding was approved in one way or another next spring, and the drawings were prepared by an architect in the spring of fall of 22, and it was bid in late fall of 22. Then construction is not a big building; it's like a big house. We think could be done in the first half of 2023, give or take. None of this is fully defined, but the potential is there to have an occupancy in August of 2023. And why that is significant is that it would free up the Parkhurst. And the reasons to free up the Parkhurst are multiple, but one of them obviously is it becomes available short-term instructional space if there's a feeling that that's important. And the other is that it could act as swing space for the Lynch School construction project, which will be going into construction sometime within the next 6 months following that. And whether or not there was an interest in moving students over for the beginning of school instead of at Christmas or something like that, a lot of districts prefer that. It's a little bit less intrusive to do it that way. Anyway, it gives a lot of, this timeline gives some reasonable flexibility around decision making, I think is the point here. So we were asked ultimately to think at least a little bit about what the challenges and opportunities are here and kind of what the implications are. And again, we can't presume to know too much about the Lynch because we have not studied it in detail, although I've walked the site and I kind of know generally what the program looks like, and we certainly know what a lot of the constraints are around that location. But sort of what we thought about around schedule, and I already sort of mentioned it, a carriage house that was completed sooner rather than later obviously gives you a lot more flexibility around what you do next, right? So it gives you opportunities around the Parkhurst and how you wish to use it, whether that, as I mentioned, was swing space or whether it's added short-term capacity for the district. Those are, you know, that's a good place to be, right? The more flexibility the more ways you can deploy your facilities, the better. In terms of cost, the construction costs appear to be pretty similar between an added piece at the Lynch versus the carriage house. We have it based on the range of numbers that's being used now publicly for the Lynch within $100,000. And the fact is that if you proceeded with the carriage house sooner rather than later, you have more cost certainty, right? You take escalation out of it, and escalation, there's a presumption around escalation. You know, people use whatever they use, a percent a quarter or something like that, 4% a year, 3% a year, 5% a year. However, you're doing less of that calculus, so it's bringing you cost certainty, and it's giving the central office obviously a location, and it's separating it from the larger debt override vote. And I don't presume to know, but if there is risk around that for the town, and the town still wants to resolve the issue of central office one way or the other, having it as a separate project, this decoupled might make sense. And that's not really my call, but it's an observation. It preserves a historic asset for the town, which has, you know, a tradition, and if you believe at all in the idea that preserving kind of historic buildings is an important mission, then this is an opportunity to do that with a program that really is logically will fit there. The standalone central office might be a more effective location, sort of solution than connected to any elementary school, Lynch or otherwise. I mean, for instance, if the Lynch has a lockdown, future Lynch has a lockdown and central offices are there, can central offices stay or do they have to go too? How do you manage an emergency? Having a separate location in a lot of ways means that it's serving all the schools equally from one sort of central location. So there's something to be said for that. And this is where, you know, we can only presume a little bit, but adding square footage to an already tight lynch site, we think it's about an 8% plus in terms of what the sort of preliminary published square footage is. If it's an 8% increase in area, that's very real, you know, and that is on a site that already is going to it'll work because some creative architect is going to solve this problem. However, it's going to be very tight and pretty complicated. So not adding more square footage over there might be a benefit to that process. And of course, if you do add central office to the lynch, there are other issues. I mean, we just finished doing a central office in an elementary school. It really is its own standalone facility, even though it's connected to an elementary school. So for instance, if it's multiple stories, it probably needs its own elevator and its own stairs. It's going to have its own entrance. It certainly has to have its own dedicated parking. All of those things have to go into the planning of the lynch project if it's at the lynch. So those are challenges. They're not insurmountable, but they're challenges. And doing nothing to the carriage house, just sort of saying, well, you know, there it is. It still has a cost, right? So either you have the carrying cost as a community, which is, you know, trying to keep it from falling over, or you say we want it to fall over, and then there are demolition costs. You got to abate it, you got to tear it down, you got to fill in the hole. So there is no sort of we'll just worry about it later solution that doesn't have a cost. So utilizing it as an actual facility that has public benefit, if it's a town-owned building, is certainly a somewhat persuasive argument. And in terms of funding, I've mentioned the flexibility that the freeing up the Parkhurst would bring. And Chris has already mentioned the fact that the MSBA has not committed to allowing a central office at the lynch. They may. It's not saying they won't. However, they have not approved it as of yet. So again, if you're putting this kind of risk analysis together, it may be that that's a risk. It may not be. I don't know how the MSBA will opine on that, but it is something that's an unknown until 2022. And in any case, even if it is at the lynch, it's not going to be reimbursable. So whether you do it at the carriage house or you do it at the lynch, it's 100% on the town's nickel. So that doesn't impact, that from a cost point of view doesn't really impact because you're paying for it one location or the other location. And I think that does it. So I think we're going to open up the questions and answers. Thank you very much for your patience. We think it's a really interesting project, and we appreciate you having the willingness to listen to it. Thanks.
Thank you, Charlie. So I'm just going to look to our chair. Karen, are you looking for us to assemble here for some discussion with the school committee? So that'll be our cue. And if folks don't mind taking a seat at the table, I just want to say a couple of words of thanks. I want to thank the TAPE team. I want to thank leadership from the Historic Society that we did meet with earlier last month. Really appreciated their feedback on site development. We did have a working group on this project that Charlie mentioned. I in particular just want to say thank you to John Clemson. The Historic Commission had a representative on that working group. John is a professional architectural historian and gave us some really helpful insight, both with respect to the massing of the building and some input on site development and parking. So John, thank you for that very much. And with that, Karen, I think you're looking to have some conversation, and maybe if time permits, we can take some questions from the audience. Our friends from Hill don't have a presentation tonight, but wanted to be here to hear this, hear our discussion, and certainly if there are questions about Lynch, about the process, they're certainly willing to jump in and do their best to answer those questions. Okay?
Thank you very much, Chris. So I think before I open it up to questions and discussion among the committee, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Hackett for his opinion on any operational observations related to these two options.
Sure.
If you could.
Thank you. First of all, I just want to be clear that I didn't ask for the corner office. It just happens to work out that way in the design. It is one of the points that was made earlier at Parkhurst. For those of you who may not know, we've actually brought 4 sections of pre-K out of the Lynch School to Parkhurst this year. there was quite a bit of work done, including an elevator that was put in to Parkhurst. So Parkhurst is really allowing Lynch to have the additional space that it needs right now just to get through what is some enrollment growth that has been enrollment growth over the last few years. Parkhurst as a central office space really just doesn't make a lot of sense. And quite literally, some of the classrooms they're all classrooms. And my office right now is probably at least 800 square feet. So that kind of space utilized for a superintendent's office where we are just trying to, we have 2 people in every classroom. That isn't necessarily by design, but everyone can't have an 800 square foot office space because there's not enough of them. So the building itself is truly a school and should be returned to function as a school. And I know that there's been conversations and questions around what is the future of Parkhurst. And that is, I know there has been discussions around it. That is a piece of work that my administration will be doing this year, picking up from the master plan and where the work has been left off. It's a bit of a confined site, so there are some challenges that way. But I think there's really good opportunity with Parkhurst, at minimum, as good swing space to get us through Lynch and the Morocco projects. Longer term, potentially some kind of centralized program that we might be able to bring there that would help alleviate space at the elementary schools. For example, pre-K has now moved in from Lynch. Kindergarten might be considered. There are other considerations that we could look at that would allow us to bring programs out of the elementary schools to help potentially accommodate growth that may be happening over the next few years, especially as I know that there are some housing projects that are both in the pipeline and I believe maybe even ground has been broken on some of them. So preliminarily, conceptually, I think that makes a lot of sense for Parkhurst. It will never make sense for us to occupy that whole building when we have space issues elsewhere. I think the point that was made around, I've been doing this for a while. I have been in elementary schools as a superintendent's office. I have been standalone. It's always of concern when you are in a school because you are part of that school culture. Set aside the issues of it really is kind of a building attached to a school and it has its own needs from an elevator to entrances to parking. But the whole business and the transactions that happen in the superintendent's office are really, in a lot of ways, completely unrelated to the operation of an elementary school. So to have any kind of other traffic that is there for business purposes, potentially, occasionally, there might be someone who's not happy who comes to the superintendent's office. We have not experienced that yet. But it's just a whole different set of purposes for that building that really are not well connected to operating an elementary school with a bunch of little children running around. So keeping it out of an elementary school is ideal. It's ideal for a lot of reasons, and one of the things that was mentioned just from a security standpoint, in the unfortunate situations where you have to have some kind of a lockdown of a school, oftentimes the superintendent's office is kind of the command center where we bring communications people in, police department, and we operate through the whatever crisis that might be, if it's a larger crisis. And I would just also add with the Lynch site, it is really tight, not just the site itself, but it's one road in and it's kind of one road out. It's so locked in within that neighborhood that the idea of trying to figure out how to have 2 separate kind of sets of traffic coming in and out of that site because it's so tight is, to me, I think a significant challenge because I do think that while the design would, try to allow for it, it seems like it's too much for that particular site. So those would just be the points that I would make. Just again, objectively, I'm not looking for this corner office, but I think is in terms of a school district and as a town, as a community, the Carriage House location does make much more sense. It does provide a long-term solution. It does keep us from having to move around and move files. And it provides a space that I think also protects an asset for the town. So, thank you.
Thank you. And with that, then I will open it up to the committee in case anybody has any questions or comments. Please. Mr. Hopcraft.
Are more in the realm of comments. I don't know if it works. Okay. And first, I know you're not asking for a corner office, but you already have a very large office right now, so it's a downgrade for you, I think. I think that what I've heard and what prior committees have determined with regard to the Parkhurst not being an appropriate location for central office, I think is a given. And I think that the potential upside value of it as swing space or just alternate space is very good. I thought the remarks, I found very interesting the remarks about safety in here, some that were mentioned and some that weren't. I hadn't considered the lockdown situation. I had thought about the fact that it feels a little bit funny to have central office in one particular school over another. But I think that safety issue regarding lockdowns is important, but also your comment that you made about the potential disgruntled person who may have an issue, whether an employee or a parent or anyone else, and how we need to segregate that from the elementary school, that it really is a building within a building that would not be joined, I think was, a really interesting point and one that I would prioritize. I think I kind of want to keep that separate from the kids as much as possible. And I like the fact that with the Carriage House location, there is off-hour use of Ambrose if you need the space of an elementary school, but you don't need it right then. Coming from the Lynch neighborhood and having one of my sons is still at Lynch, it is a super tight site. It's narrow getting in and out. I know parking is always an issue everywhere. Nowadays, when you drop off your kids, their cars are up and down the streets all around the neighborhood. So I do think there's a fairly significant impact of adding 25 more parking spaces to that site. I suspect that when it comes time to design that building, it's going to be more vertical than horizontal, and so I imagine a central office would take up prime first floor real estate in that building. I think just for a lot of reasons, I think it doesn't make sense, particularly on the Lynch site. I don't think it really makes sense to be in any building, unless, by the way, there was a significant cost or other overriding reason to override some of these points. I thought it was interesting on the financial analysis that we have sort of a relatively certain cost of what doing the Carriage House would be versus a more ambiguous future potential cost of another location. But when they added in the carrying or destruction costs of the historic asset that we have, it kind of makes the Carriage House seem like the more economical location to be in, break even or more economical. And lastly, I'll say, it is a beautiful town asset that really ought to be preserved, in my view, especially where there isn't an overwhelming or overriding reason to do otherwise. So those are more reaction and commentary to this, but I tend to lean in the direction that you and the architects have suggested, that the Carriage House feels like the safer, equally or slightly more economical, less impact on other school, protect various assets of our town solution. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Mr. Nixon.
If I can, Mr. Hopcraft raised a couple of interesting points I want to be sure we hit squarely in our discussion. Charlie mentioned in his presentation it's about 8% bigger. I want to be clear to everybody that what we've gone out with publicly is a conceptual program for Lynch. It's in the RFP. It comes out of the master plan. Flansburgh Architects developed that. They were the architects of the McCall addition. Very reputable firm. They've done a lot of work with us here as well. Did the E-wing at McCall. So they're in this space, and they have a sense of how to sort of program and put an elementary school together. So at a conceptual level, we have an idea that the new Lynch, as it sits today in our minds, it's about 91,000 square feet. So that's where this 8% is coming from. It's it's important to clarify to people that when we talk about the Lynch cost, and there's a cost range, that does not include central office. That would be an additional 8% and then an additional, some millions of dollars. But not only is it 8% bigger, this is prime space that's really going to be, and I'm putting on an architect's hat for a minute, sort of competing for prime time real estate. So when we think about an elementary school, we think about what wants to be on that main level, the principal's office, right? The reception, cafeteria, gymnasium for sure. Certain spaces are going to want to be competing for that. And so one might imagine similarly, central office is going to want a piece of that. So there's going to be really some challenges around kind of the programming and design piece. When we talk about how tight the site is, I want some people I know in this room know what we're talking about because they were involved in some measure in the Winchester High School feasibility study. But for those that weren't, we actually looked at the Lynch site. We were required by the state to look at Lynch as a possible location for this high school. And it was ruled out largely because of water. The 100-year floodplain cuts across a substantial portion of the fields. So the fields that are there that are a part of our site, much of that is sort of ruled out for construction as it stands today. So there are a number of factors when we say the site. We're really talking about what are you left with when you sort of put those restrictions on. In addition, the school committee said back when we voted, Michelle, I think our first statement of interest to the MSBA, we said just what Mr. Hopcraft did, that we presume that if we can keep the Lynch that we have, it's a multi-story building. It's something like a VO, which is kind of like a 3-story with a walkout basement, that faces Johnson Road, because we really wanted to avoid swing space. Swing space, like all the village of modulars that you all saw here at the high school when this was under construction, swing space is not reimbursable by the MSBA. That's all on our nickel. So to whatever extent we can avoid swing space, it's cost reduction on our part. And so although we don't yet have an architect on board, and we will soon for Lynch, we have heard through our friends at Hill a lot of interest of the architects who've walked the site and who've submitted. What is Winchester swing space? Do you know how tight this site is? And then, of course, when are you going to make a decision on central office? So that's going to be really foremost in their minds. With respect to costs, we have been using a cost range that's around, I think it's $504 to $512, something like that per square foot. And we've been using that for a while. That was also developed by PM&C, same group that TAPE has been working with. PM&C were the estimators on the Vincent Owen project, and McCall. I agree, very, very reputable firm. But these are numbers that came out before COVID. So what superintendent gets, I think on some regular basis from the MSBA, you kind of get an update on where elementary schools are as they're approaching different milestones in design. We're seeing elementary schools right now going out for bid, coming in at $500 a foot, $520 a foot, $530 a foot. So to just underscore Charlie's comment about the cost of escalation, we really won't know what Lynch will cost. We're hoping for a fall 25 opening. We hope to be bidding Lynch in around January or February of 24. So that's a long way away. So I want to just make those points. Thank you.
Ms. Bergstrom.
I wanted to move back to the presumption about emergency management for a moment, because as a parent of 3 kids who have graduated from Ambrose Elementary, I think that site is equally tight. I think that the traffic along High Street is equally challenging. And I think that the parking lot that's already next to the Carriage House is frequently in use by both Ambrose visitors, staff, and parents. So I think in terms of the tightness of the space, the proximity to a school building, I'm not sure that the Carriage House site buys us anything in terms of that site versus Lynch. I think they have benefits and risks in each one of them in terms of emergency management. If Ambrose is locked down, presumably the building next to it's going to be locked down as well. Typically, if there's a lockdown at a school, they often require all the buildings in the area to be locked down. So I think that having the Carriage House next to Ambrose is the same presumption as having it next to Lynch, except that it doesn't share a wall. So I think that in terms of thinking about safety for our kids and safety for the community, having any any central office in proximity of an elementary school is going to carry some kind of risk in that way. I think the things that are not, that aren't the same about both of the sites is clearly that as a member of the committee that approved the master plan and saw that looking at Parkhurst and looking at the Carriage House and understanding that Parkhurst was never going to be a long-term solution, that it is not any kind of a site that is going to provide us with good space for professional development, good space for collaboration among our administration members, and having a site that can have us do that is definitely an advantage, and having it be one that could be preserving a town asset is an incredible advantage in that way versus building a building from scratch, because it's just a legacy we would be able to provide back to Winchester by maintaining the historic nature of the Carriage House in that way. I did have some questions for Tape. I was curious, I didn't see in the documentation we were provided, in terms of the historic nature of that building, what percentage of the building would be able to be retained versus how much of it would be sort of a from scratch new building? Or is there a percentage you could put on that for us so we could communicate that to others as well?
We can't, I don't think at this instant, give you a percentage. However, we could easily get that to you quickly. A vast majority of the existing building is being retained. So there's only that one small wing that's being removed and replaced.
Right.
So most of the building, 80% of it maybe, is being preserved. The entire exterior envelope is entirely being preserved. The interior, the structure will be preserved. However, obviously finishes, if you can see, if you've been there and if you've seen those photographs, you know, would have to be removed and replaced. But generally it is a restoration. It isn't a replacement.
And in your experience, is that when you're restoring or replacing a building like that, one of the suggestions has been made that we might be able to partner with some of the historical societies on grants in terms of funding. Do you find with the amount of restoration that we need to do to the Carriage House that that would still be a viable option?
I think there's a possibility of some grant money out there. I don't think it's going to be overwhelmingly significant, but
Okay.
I think it's possible.
Thank you. And I'm also curious if your study included any kind of a traffic study for that area.
It did not.
Okay.
We're simply not talking about very much volume of traffic here, I think, is the you know, and we certainly looked at the layout of the site plan, but in terms of traffic counts or anything, we did not do that because we know that it's a very limited amount of cars.
We should probably clarify for folks who are here from the commission and the society that when Charlie says Cesar did some destructive testing on the envelope, that was on the inside, not the outside.
Not the outside.
Just want to be clear.
So I'm also curious, the construction timeline, Chris, is while kids are at Ambrose. Have we looked at what the impact of the staff parking and the area around Ambrose would be if construction's going on during a school year?
So that's a great question. Short answer is no. Longer answer is the design option that TAP presented today kind of came from a design team, and we learned fairly late in the process through a very helpful meeting with the society at Sanborn House that they had actually on their own engaged an architect and landscape architect to look at developing an expanded parking solution in that same area defined by the lease. It is they're very similar in terms of location. They're a little different in terms of execution. The scheme actually that the society had, this is again very conceptual, actually accommodates more cars than where we have, where we're showing. But as you know, there's a lot of topography on the site. Yeah. And so what we kind of committed to the society is that should this project, should the school committee wish to proceed with the Carriage House, we would look to kind of work with the society and further kind of develop and refine what that parking option looks like. And then associated with that, as you can well imagine, you have to kind of figure out what it is before you can then figure out, so what are the means and methods of construction and so forth. I would have to assume that, Anything that would be sort of invasive in terms of the site that would impact drop-off, pickup would be something we would look to do during the summer months or some, big break in the school calendar.
And in terms of using Parkhurst as swing space for Lynch, we would need well more than Parkhurst for swing space for Lynch. I just want to be clear with the community about that as well. We would not be able to pick up Lynch Elementary and put it in Parkhurst.
That's right.
For one thing, we have preschool classrooms in the bottom level right now.
Yes, and I think, and in Charlie's slide, I think it was maybe just a footnote that Lynch does not, so Parkhurst it can't accommodate all of Lynch. There's no question about that. There's two ways to think about this, Ms. Bergstrom. So one is, and again, I'm going to make an analogy to this building. When we were working with the MSBA on this high school project, we had a conversation with them about this very space that we're sitting in right now, whether this space could be demolished and built new. And what we were told by the MSBA is, well, the auditorium you have and the stage you have are too big for Winchester. They're too big for your school population, so you're better off just keeping the structure, gutting the interior, and then kind of making it new again, and that's what's happened. So if this had been new build, it would have been smaller.
Right.
I expect that we're going to encounter some similar decision points associated with Lynch, because when we say the new Lynch Elementary School, we really don't know yet what new means. It might mean a multi-story building, kind of like VO, built across the playground, and then one day the kids move into the new building and we take the old one down. I mean, that could be great. That will be challenging. But the MSBA actually requires us, and if I misstate this, please jump in, Vivian, but they actually require us to look at all the options, including renovation, addition. So it may well be that we look at keeping perhaps the gymnasium at Lynch, the space up above for some purpose, and maybe we start actually look at taking pieces of Lynch down in a phased way, in which case Parkhurst could be very helpful. So that was one option. The other is, if it really needs to be a wholesale move, we still have a site at Parkhurst. It's not just the building, it's the site. And if we need to bring in modular classrooms to then add more capacity, our cost for doing that will be less because we still had a building that was substantially available on the first floor. So what we will need for swing space, we don't know, but to Charlie's point, it's good to have that flexibility. But Vivian, you wanted to say something. You might come to the mic just so they catch you at home? I just want to be sure they hear you at home, that's all.
In addition to the swing space, what you do have at the Parkhurst that you're not kind of anticipating or taking into consideration is the need for bathroom facilities. Where Parkhurst already has facilities available that can be utilized, whereas if you are adding modular classrooms and you move the entire school to a new site with modular classrooms, you also have to make sure that you are providing adequate facilities for not only the staff, but for students as well. So some of those are where a lot of the costs come in, because now you have to provide plumbing, water, and put it, kind of take it to where you're planning on putting that modular. Whereas if you do already have it available at Parkhurst, you could utilize it. Putting some of the younger kids in the building and the older kids in modular outside, that they can make a trek into the classrooms, or having less facilities required. That's an option as well.
Can I just speak one more, just as a follow-up point? At Parkhurst, in a phased renovation, construction, occupied project, which you're very familiar with, has been pointed out, it may be that we could probably at Parkhurst accommodate 2 full grade levels. So it might be that we take the 4th and the 5th grade at Parkhurst, or some combination that would then allow the building that's being, that the kids would have been in, to be phased in as part of the renovation. So I think it just, to me, emphasizes that Parkhurst is going to be needed, to the point where if it's not the Carriage House, then I don't know what it would be,
Right.
Because I do not think we can continue to stay there through this project.
Right. And I was going to say one last question. Mr. Nixon, well, Dr. Hackett isn't interested in the corner office, I'm interested in where the school committee room moves to, because I did
yeah.
not see one in that central office.
Yep, so that's a great question. We talked about that at the working group level. So we kind of two-part answer to that. We would envision school committee kind of going back to the model it was at Lynch. So our meetings are typically, Tuesday evenings. We would meet. I actually love this. I love going into an elementary school. This is long after the bell rings, so the school is pretty much vacant. Our custodial staff are there. We would have school committee meetings in the library. There's a library media center at Ambrose. I like the fact that community can sort of come into the school for a public meeting of that nature. But then if you saw that first slide that Charlie showed, at the lower level, there's really a very large conference room. And so as you know, Ms. Bergstrom, from time to time, we may have like a subcommittee meeting or like a focused school committee meeting on one particular issue, and it needs to happen during the day. That might be accommodated in the lower level of the Carriage House. And with respect to just records management and so on, there is more than enough space that we're actually currently showing in that plan. If we're able to get some traction on like really getting a records management plan going, and we should move forward with this option, we may find that room could become even larger. And to that extent, we actually had a request from the society that if they had some evening events, and would it be possible to make that lower level room available to them? And we said we'd be happy to work with them on something like that as well. We want to be good neighbors. They're tenants, and they're right across the drive.
Right. I know it's concerning to me not have a permanent space for committee meetings for the public to be able to access and find us. And knowing the challenges that WinCam has, and with all the new technology we're using with committee meetings, I would want to make sure that somewhere in that space would be a meeting room where committees in the future could meet on a regular basis for the consistency of the community.
Thank you very much. And with that, Mr. Brady.
Thank you. I think there's been a lot of great points made so far. I just wanted to touch quickly on a few of them. One piece, I think the sooner that we can free up Parkhurst, the better. I think we could have unanticipated needs. We've currently moved some preschool classes there. Nothing's to say that we might not have a need for more space next year or the year after. So I think that's definitely something we want to take into account. Chris always shares with me, and I'm pretty confident in this number as a minimum. If you just need to add a modular classroom somewhere, that's generally $1 million or more. So next year, that no one knows what enrollment growth could be, what the needs could be, and so the sooner that we're able to free up Parkhurst for any types of classrooms, I would certainly say the better. And I like Dr. Hackett's thought that he mentioned, there is the potential there in the long term of some kind of gathering of pre-K or preschool. So that's a centralized possibility in the long term. So I think that's just worth noting. And to Mr. Hopcraft and Mr. Nixon's points about Lynch, I would certainly be concerned about taking away space at Lynch for a central office, knowing that there are some constraints on the site. I think that's another important thing just to keep in mind as kind of a downside for having it at Lynch. I wouldn't want us to lose space that could be part of the school. We already have a lot of classrooms that are maxed out throughout the district. We have specialists who don't necessarily have their own space, and so I think as much space as we can preserve for the elementary school, I think that's really important, and that is our focus, and so to me that's kind of a significant point, is if we're going to put this at Lynch, then we're going to lose space one way or another that potentially could be devoted to the elementary school.
Very much.
Oh, and I'm sorry, just Michelle made a really great point. I really think it is important for us to have a space for the school committee to meet that is dedicated for that purpose and maybe other purposes, but I do think we should have an adequate dedicated space somewhere. I think that is important for a school committee, and it doesn't necessarily have to be in one of our buildings. Lots of different committees meet in lots of different places, but wherever it is, I think we should have a particular place for that, and not necessarily just doing it in kind of an ad hoc space in an elementary school.
Mr. Hopcraft.
Next, add on to Mr. Brady and Ms. Bergstrom's point about the space. I think accessibility is really important, and so I appreciate the point of having a place that everyone knows is where we will be. Although, I guess when I think about accessibility and also use of space, I like Mr. Nixon's suggestion that when the meeting can be held in a place that's being used by other people, we shouldn't have a space just for us. It should be multi-use for others. And I appreciate the notion of records management, maybe moving that wall over, getting a little bit bigger room. We could also make these meetings more accessible with our friends at WinCam and Zoom and others to let people beam in. And I think accessibility is the analysis, and I actually kind of like the suggestion of moving around to the different schools because that lets people who know their school be able to come, it may be more accessible for them to pop into where their kids are. So I just wanted to put a vote of, I'm on the fence as to where it is, but I think the discussion should be around accessibility as to whether it's a dedicated space or moving around or hybrid technology or whatnot. Thank you.
I mean, a couple of other
Mr.
points.
Nixon.
So I should have put another image up there when I talked about sort of TAPE's experience. The slide I showed was just their experience in Winchester. In addition to being architects of elementary and secondary education, they have some experience in historic preservation and restoration. They completed not long ago a project with Bridgewater, I think. Town Hall, which was in really kind of deplorable condition, similar kind of scenario, restored envelope, the interior spaces in a project that's now complete. Kind of look very similar to some of the renderings that Charlie shared tonight. The point I just wanted to make, though, that project was LEED silver, I believe. If this committee wants to kind of set some goals around sustainability, we can and we should do that. When Charlie talks about an all-electric building, I just wanted to underscore why that's important. For those who are not familiar, the governor issued the Massachusetts, I think it's the 2030 plan or 2035 plan. Institutional buildings are a real contributor towards climate change in Massachusetts, and there is a real need to wean ourselves off of fossil fuels, and to that end, the state is recommending that we look at things like all-electric heat pumps for heating and cooling the building. So the MEP narrative, there's a tremendous amount of mechanical, electrical, plumbing work that's already been done to derive these cost estimates. And that's all informed by things like that Massachusetts 2030 plan. So I think a lot of good thought has already gone into this, just in terms of not kind of how we might have done it 10 years ago or how we might do it right now, but just thinking towards the future. I wanted to make that point. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments from the committee? So I will just say that I appreciate very much TAPE's presentation this evening, and also the work that you've done thus far, and also the many questions and comments from the committee, many of which I also had. So some of the things that I was thinking regarding the central office relocation that I think are important. I guess I also acknowledge that there's that it is best to try to avoid the competing spaces between our central office and its business transactions and the nature of central office operations and administration, and keep that separate from our instructional spaces. And if we know, or if we are assuming that if we are projecting that the Lynch School is going to be 91,000 square feet at some point, I think it is. I think we just need to be keenly aware of not, or of the impact of trying to add central office into that space, because I think that will just. I think it's a significant expansion and cost. And also, just from a security perspective, I appreciate Dr. Hackett's input on keeping the central office transactions, and if we were to be in a lockdown situation, or if there were other issues that just came up around safety, I think it's important to be able to keep our central office administration and our schools separate. And I also acknowledge that is a tight site over at the Lynch School, and also at Ambrose. So I do see that as well. I think that there is, I agree, I have to agree, I think there is a better use of the space at Parkhurst as a swing space, or for the Lynch construction, or just down the road with our increasing enrollment. And also, just finally, I also agree that I would just like to see that the building, or I think it would be nice to preserve the building and have another historical asset in the town. So.
Karen, can I just jump in?
Yes.
Because you thanked Cafe, and I know Mr. Nixon didn't slide earlier, but I just wanted to also publicly thank town meeting, because we wouldn't be having this discussion today if town meeting hadn't funded the study to be able to do the space program review and move the Carriage House forward. Because, as Mr. Nixon noted, our committee began to try to move the Carriage House forward in 2017. So to be able to see it come to this point where we can have a discussion with information on paper and be able to weigh the costs and benefits of using the Carriage House or Lynch or wherever central office ends up, I think that we have to acknowledge town meeting today too.
I think that's a great point, and I would just add to that although I know we're very concerned today about escalation and the impact COVID has on construction and bids, the good news is for this project, the bids came a little under budget because TAP A's fee wasn't as high as we thought it might be. Sorry, guys. So we have a little money left over in the kitty. And one of the things that we have done, as school committee knows, we made a request this cycle of the capital planning committee for $57,000, which is just some incremental funding that will allow us, should the committee opt to go with the Carriage House, which is part of why this discussion is so important today, if we wish to proceed with the Carriage House, taking this concept that you heard from Tepe today, one more step to design development, will allow us to do a couple of things. Number one, in my view, hold that number that Charlie presented and quite possibly even bring it down. There are a lot of assumptions, as you heard, with respect to fixtures, equipment, finishings, and so forth. And that the renderings are beautiful, but is it hardwood maple or is it plastic laminate? Are they? What kind of hardware are we using? Let's talk about the furniture, et cetera. There are dollars there, right? And the same is true around technology. So I think it would certainly be appropriate to go one more step and to be that much more specific and sure about the number, because then the more difficult conversation is, where do we find the funding? And when we go and we ask for money, the good news is we've been really doing very well in terms of major capital projects. When we say what something's going to cost and we ask for the money and we get the funding, that has a lot to do with the design team and the estimators that work. It's a real credit to the EFPBC over the years that have been managing these projects. And just to that note, Jay Nardone, who's the chair of the EFPBC, has a real interest in a project like this coming before the EF. If we should proceed, the EFPBC would be willing to kind of step up and play their usual role.
Mr. Hopcraft.
One last question, I think for Mr. Nixon. It would be helpful as we think about the different options, if we have some sort of ballpark figure on what it would cost to continue to maintain the building so it doesn't continue to deteriorate if we don't go into it or demolish it. If those were, just so you can balance what are the totality of the costs of option A versus B, because that's the one piece that was, it seemed like we were fairly close before that, and I don't know how big that number is.
So is your question about what it would cost to just maintain the building sort of in its current state? Correct.
It sounded like there was a lot of water leakage and that perhaps a new roof would be needed and a few things like that. What are so we have three options, it seems. You either renovate that building, you keep the building going, which means a new roof or whatever else you need to do to keep it going. What's the cost of that? Or you tear it down, which sounds like a significant cost as well, not to mention the tragic loss of a historic asset in our town. So just even if it's rough ballparks, when we're looking at these numbers, we're estimating years out. There's a lot of ambiguity. It seems like they're not too far apart. Does that swing it sharply in one direction, or is it de minimis?
So all I could offer there is certainly the most critical element to preserving the Carriage House is the roof. And there's some members of capital planning that are here tonight who recall that I think it was 3 years ago, our school facilities manager, Pete Lawson, actually came forward and asked for some funding to do a roof design at the Carriage House. That was actually, there was lengthy discussion at the table about this. That request was withdrawn because Capital said, we'll go to town meeting to fund the full study so long as it's the full study. So we do have information in the cost estimate I think we could look at that will tell us, what a roof costs, and perhaps we can pull that information out and share it. We'd still have to actually come up with a design, of course, but we've got some information from PMNC that we could pull together.
And I believe the demolition cost was about $300,000 I believe the demolition cost was about $300,000, they said, but that was a number of years old at this point.
So it was around, I believe it was around 200 back in like 2012. So there was a time when, the school committee, having discussed, do we want to surplus the building or
Right,
not? The school committee at the time said no, because when we surplus the building, it's gone for good.
Right.
The building may be something we want to use, the land may be something we want to use. Is there some alternative in the middle? And that's where this idea came up of maybe the school committee would want to be a landlord. What if we abated the building of hazardous materials, restored the envelope, and basically created what I call like just a big dumb box, kind of like when a tenant at Burlington Mall vacates and they get ready for a new one to move in. It's just a white box. The school committee actually looked at that and worked with TAPE at the time, and we determined that cost was around $800,000 or $850,000 just to get the building ready for someone to move in. By the way, that did not include an elevator. That was literally just cleaning up the space and eliminating the hazards. To help us understand that cost relative to something else, we also asked TAPE, so what would it cost to tear it down? And so that is again, abating hazardous materials, cutting and capping utilities, demolition, restoring the site, filling the hole, and that was close to $200,000 at the time. So it's a real significant cost. To Charlie's point earlier, whether we move central office to the Carriage House or not, up on the hill sits a building built in 1908 that's loaded with hazardous materials, and even if someday that building should come down, we're on the hook for those costs. So, and those costs don't get cheaper each year, they get more and more expensive.
And Mr. Nixon, I believe we also considered a fourth option that Mr. Hopcraft didn't mention, which was renting space, which was not using the Carriage House, not using Lynch, not using Parkhurst, but in fact renting space. And
for central office.
For central office, yeah.
Yes, you're right. And although that did not wind up in like the final master plan, it was studied. In fact, our cost modeling is somewhere buried in the appendix. If anybody wants to read that 500-page document, our director of finance, in fact, did just that. We looked at what would the cost be to basically rent space for 20 years. We picked 20 because that's typically how long you would bond a major capital project, on the assumption that there was no fit-up cost, which is not realistic, of course, assuming that there was space available suited for our needs with all the fixtures, furnishings, and equipment that we would need. And after running through that and very conservative estimates about increases in the lease rate and renewing, I think, every 4 or 5 years, we found it was like within $50,000 or $100,000 of the cost of just renovating the building. And of course, at the end of 20 years, in that scenario, you're not left with a permanent home. You're still renting space, as opposed to you have a permanent home. So yes, we did look at that, but that's why it didn't wind up as any one of the serious alternatives that we looked at the master
plan. Okay, are there any other comments or questions from the committee? And seeing as we have some time left, I am willing to allow some questions from our members of our boards and organizations from around town. And I will extend it to you since I see your hand first.
And could you please say your name and which committee you're with when you come up to the mic for all the committee members as well? It's hard to see everybody behind their masks.
Hi, I am Bob Colt, and I'm the longest-standing member of the Historical Society Board and past president of the Historical Society in Sanborn House. The Carriage House was at its time a grandiose building. It was part of the Sanborn Estate, which originally, of course, went all the way up to Westland. And the Carriage House was designed so that you could slalom up the sledding hill to the Carriage House, and that from, it was just a perfect location. The views were really grandiose. And additionally, it had a carousel inside that, took 10 cars. And so 10 cars could be parked inside basically at once, which was, at that time, 1908, was quite a feat. And I would like to see in this process a real partnership between the school committee and the Historical Society / Sanborn House. Obviously, the Sanborn House Carriage House, it was the garage and extra space in this estate. And, it's just like you wouldn't want to see your garage and extra office space used for anything else but part of that original building. So we would like to work very closely on a partnership that would look to potentially the Sanborn House Society and the society to, use the facility. Originally, we had looked at it and thought, okay, the front entrance would lead into a grandiose room that you could have events for 80 to 100 people. And there's a real need for the Historical Society and their programming, of course, once we get over COVID a little bit, to have space. A lot of the rooms at the Sanborn House fit 40, 50 people, and we really have a need for, 80 to 100 people. So as we talk over with the architects, if it's going to go in that direction, we would like to see how we could come up with a joint sponsorship, partnership, whatever you would like to call it. So I would hope that people would keep that in mind. We've met, of course, 10 days ago or so for the first time with Mr. Nixon and the superintendent and others, and that was good. But we need to have a series of meetings coming right up for a whole board of, of the Historical Society. So let's talk about a partnership, looking always at this as an estate and not losing the historical significance. And, it's always dangerous, and we sort of stopped it about 4 years ago when people were talking about tearing down the Carriage House and making it a parking lot. So we met with the Historical Commission and had our own working group that talked about the significance of the Carriage House, and we would like to make sure that that is not lost sight of. So we look forward to that partnership and talking with you a whole bunch more. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I would just add that my offer of having my office in the Sanborn House is still on the table. That's the kind of partnership I think we should be discussing. I felt like it got dismissed really quickly, so I just thought I'd mention it again.
Ms. Allison.
Not turning on my mic. See, he's tired of listening to me.
There you have it.
I'll do that again. Samantha Allison, Precinct 3 Town Meeting member, former member and chair of the Finance Committee. And in that capacity, I spent 4 years on the former Superintendent's Budget Advisory Council, was also privy to a lot of the school's master plan efforts, and a member of the Winchester Town Master Plan Committee. So first, just phenomenal progress. I agree with Ms. Bergstrom's remarks. It's really nice to see the evolution of these conversations that we were having so many years ago. So kudos to everybody who's been involved, and thanks for all the efforts that I'm sure that took. A couple of comments and then one question for you. First, just sort of a random comment. Personally, I'm not in favor of using the building as a tenant-occupied space unless it had something really closely tied to education, just because of the proximity to the Ambrose School. So I would just ask for caution there if that continues. I realize that's not really on the table anymore, but just a thought given that that was raised. I support the notion of trying to quantify the options again as this, depending on where the committee goes with this, if this comes forward to town meeting. I do think you need to help town meeting understand what those choices are and the different costs around those and pros and cons of each of those. I also, Ms. Bergstrom, you'll be, I think, pleased to hear, I also noticed that there was no school committee space in the design, but then I actually came to the conclusion prior to the comments here that that made sense, that we should better utilize the various school spaces and other options that we have in town versus dedicating square footage of that facility. So I'm not a member of school committee, so I realize, take that for what it's worth. But as someone who pre-COVID attended a lot of school committee meetings, I welcome the notion of rotating through the different facilities in town and using that as an opportunity to keep the public engaged and aware of the state of our various schools. So get people into Lynch, get people into Morocco, let them see what that space looks like so they understand why those schools are considered for replacement or renovation. Let's see. I think my only other real question, and the school committee, the legacy school committee members have heard this from me before, as we've looked at school projects, I've always pushed to think long-term about our needs, recognizing our enrollment growth. So that's where my question goes when we look at the Carriage House is, what are the options for additional workspaces as the needs of the town evolve and change over time? So how many more people could you fit in that space if you need to, just to make sure that it's not something that we outgrow much more rapidly than we currently expect. So I'm not sure what you've looked at for contingency space there. Otherwise, my other questions have been addressed through the conversation, so thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Can I actually direct that one back to Dr. Hackett? Because we actually have the advantage that you've come from a different district very recently. Do you see the space, as TAPE has designed it, as being flexible for changing needs of size of administration if our district would grow a little bit?
So the short answer is yes. We actually, I believe, have a couple of workstation spaces that are undesignated, that if we needed to add on somebody at some point, even like sometimes like during the summertime, we might have a peak load, we bring someone on to help with registrations, for example. But there is flexibility within the space to do that.
And do you see, just knowing districts across the state, districts maintaining individual office spaces? A lot of our businesses are moving to open office spaces and things like that. Is there, I don't have a sense from the preliminary drawings that we have here, would it also be able to add, without too much trouble, additional staff members to sort of more open co-working spaces in this kind of design?
I think CAPE's done a really good job of kind of, and with the central office staff, they spent a lot of time and they were very receptive and listened to the feedback. I think we might have kind of maxed that out just from a standpoint of, we have, for example, the Director of Special Education has their own office because we know that there's going to be confidential conversations that are going to happen with the door closed. But I also think there's some spaces that allow someone to go to a confidential office to have a conversation. So I think the flexibility that's been built in is really good.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just add on that one of the things that was very interesting to me, remember, central office went to Parkhurst because that was just the only option, and we had to get out of Lynch. And so we have senior staff members who are now sharing classrooms that are 950 square feet because it'd be ridiculous for one person to be in that much space. What's really fantastic about what's happened since 2013 is it's actually made our central office staff a higher functioning team. Our team members like being together, sharing space together. There's a colleague to bounce an idea off of. It builds a stronger relationship, and we know this because that kind of came out in the programming exercise. Typically the way this would begin is you sort of go through a building, you talk to people, and Cesar says, well, I need an office of 120, and Charlie wants one of 200, and Andy wants one of 300, and you add it all up. Now you got all these boxes. That wasn't the case here because there's some folks who really built a professional relationship and they're happy to share space. And to Dr. Hackett's point, because imagine for a moment the assistant superintendent and the director of personnel each might have a scenario where they need to have a private conversation. The design that TAPE has come up with has like an adjacent space for a small breakout space. And Ms. Kirby herself said, oh, but if Jen needs to have a private conversation, I'll just pop out. I'll go over here and I can still get my work done. So there's some just kind of neat flexibility, I think, built into the plan. But I have to give the credit to the leadership team who's frankly happy and enthusiastic about working that way. Jack had to leave, but I just wanted to acknowledge, John, is there any sort of comment on behalf of the commission that you wanted to make? I think Jack had to catch a flight or something, so okay.
Terrific. And I just would like to thank you, Mr. Clemson, for your participation in this process along the way.
Yeah, thanks. Am I on there? Yeah. Good. Yeah, the Historical Commission has had the opportunity to work with the school board and the society, and over, it's been 10 years or 15 years to find a way to put this building into some use so that it survives. So, you know, this is a very elegant solution. I think it fits with a really good preservation program in terms of just preserving the asset. So I think that's all we have to say. The Historical Commission supports this as a good way to save this building. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Johnson.
Committee. We've had several questions, and Chris has been very helpful. One of the biggest questions we've been asking for 3 years is, what is the plan for Parkhurst? Tonight we got an indication of what the plan may be. What we didn't get is what is going to be the cost of that plan. And in the foreseeable future, it would help the Capital Planning Committee to have a rough plan, 3 to 5 year, 5 to 10, whatever. And what is it going to cost to remodel this as a sectional elementary school, swing space? As you're well aware, there are demands on that Parkhurst building, windows, roof, etc. We spent $1 million on it when we did over VO, and that was just a Band-Aid. We just spent, Chris, $1 million on the elevator to make it functional, to combine the up and down stairs. Very fortunate that we had a flood down there, and that the insurance company
You have to explain that.
substantially updated downstairs facility to allow it to be pre-K classes or whatever else we want to have. We have plumbing issues there. We have bathroom issues. So I think it's very important from the capital point of view. We really know what the plan for Parkhurst is and what the estimated cost. I mean, we're figuring somewhere between 5 and 10% of an annual increase lately with capital projects based upon inflation and the cost of money. Another thing is, have you looked at what is the cost of a new building? You're talking about right now to rehab a building that will accommodate 8,100 square feet of about $617 per square foot. What is the cost if you built a new one? What are the other options if it's not at that location? I know the land is limited, and it's nice to throw these out and not worry about what the future is. But I think it's an important issue we have. And the biggest problem is, how are you going to fund it? There is no money within the capital budget and the building stabilization budget to fund this project, as we all know. Actually, to fund most projects, as we all know. You're going to have to look outside of an outside funding source. Is that going to be successful? And we've also got 2 major school projects, hopefully within the next 10 years, they're going to have to be done and financed through an override or an outside funding project. And it's not buying a lottery ticket. So I think it's very important we take a larger look at the whole picture. And I know Chris and I have talked about this, of where is all the money going to come from and how successful are we going to be asking the citizens of this town to contribute. Thank you.
Can I make just a couple
Yes,
comments?
Mr. Nixon.
So I appreciate that very much, Jimmy, and you're quite right. We've been talking about Parkhurst for 3 or 4 years now. I think what we can all expect is kind of better definition of a short-term plan, because that's always easier what's coming next. I think what you heard about tonight, when we say short term, we're talking about between now and when a new Lynch opens up. So a vacated Parkhurst could handle enrollment growth, which there was a fantastic school committee meeting, by the way, in May. Brian Zakelli, our town planner, came, I think that was May, came and presented with an update on our many housing projects. So the River Street 40B project is moving along. Those kids are going to hit Lynch. The Cambridge Street housing project is now moving. Those kids are going to hit VO. We used to have an integrated pre-K program at Lynch. About 4 years ago, Dr. Evans took a couple of those classrooms and moved them to VO, where we had space at the time because we were out of space at Lynch. You just heard Dr. Hackett say, now we're moving what's left of pre-K at Lynch and we're moving it into VO. So when the Cambridge Street project happens and if those kids hit VO, we had growth, by the way, over the summer. This is a good thing in our language-based learning disability program. I think we've added some space there to accommodate a growth in enrollment as well. We may, Jimmy, say in the short term, let's get the pre-K out of VO and bring them to Parkhurst, and at least now we get some operational efficiency, and once again we have a integrated preschool program, but that's short term. If alternatively or in addition there's some way to use some space at the upper level as a swing space resource to help Lynch, that's also short term. But I want to come back to the master plan and make an important point. We said in the master plan in 2017 that we also did not want to surplus the Mystic School site, because if we continue to grow the way we've been growing for years, we will come to a point where we have to have a serious conversation about a 6th neighborhood elementary school. The Mystic School site is in the right place for that because it allows us to sort of divide that pizza into 6 slices instead of 5. We said in the master plan that Parkhurst is not in the right place. You can throw a stone and hit Ambrose from the parking lot. So geographically, it's not in the right place. So what may well happen is when we talk about long-term plans for Parkhurst, imagine a new Lynch is built. By the way, the new Lynch that we're envisioning right now will open with a capacity for 100 more students than VO had when it opened in 2013. 100 more kids. And in addition to that, an integrated pre-K program is what we wish for, and it's expanded. We've told the MSBA we want to expand pre-K by 20% at least. So when Lynch is finished, it may be that the schools don't have much of a use for Parkhurst. We'll have to see what has happened with enrollment by that point. Maybe we have a conversation about surplusing Parkhurst back to the town. Our town clerk has been storing records there for years. It's an opportunity for our new rec director to maybe expand some of his services. When I say surplus it, I don't mean to knock it down. I mean, we are a growing town, and many of us here are aware of the many sort of needs and demands of different departments. So Parkhurst is definitely an asset. But to really more directly address Jimmy's question about what would it cost long term, we've been using for years in town a VFA facilities database. It kind of tracks the replacement and renewal costs of all of our buildings, both municipal and school. It's based largely on, the size of the building, the age of the building, and so forth. That last run of the VFA report, Jimmy, which was I think a couple of years ago, estimated we had $14 to $15 million in costs at Parkhurst in what we call level 1 and level 2 needs. You're quite right. We spent about $1 million back in 2011, and it was just Band-Aids. So that's a real significant cost. I can't imagine the school committee coming to Capitol to ask for $14 million for Parkhurst unless we have a really good idea that we're going to do something with it long term. I think we're going to have to first just focus on the short term piece. But I appreciate your points 100%.
Thank you very much. Any further questions? Otherwise, I would say that since we have our executive session coming up after this, I'd like to move us on to our action items, which include consideration of Carriage off the central office relocation options and consideration of the fall town meeting warrant. So with that, I would just invite our committee to open up the discussion around the options that have been presented to us today. And I will just make the point that typically our process is that we hear a presentation, a report once, and then we come back at a following meeting to vote or to consider something for approval if we choose to do so. And so we can maintain that. We are under no pressure today to make a vote, but we do have that flexibility. So if we would just like to discuss the options right now, that is fine.
I would actually prefer the second option, Ms. Bolognese, because I think this is the first time our community has had an opportunity to see this. We don't have an idea of how many people are at home watching on WinCam that weren't able to be with us today. And for accessibility and for communication and transparency with the community, I think it would be most prudent to wait until our next meeting to have that discussion and vote on both of those options, in case members of the community between now and our next meeting have questions that they would like to get to the superintendent or Mr. Nixon or any member of this committee, to make sure that we get all the questions answered, because we really need the community as partners in this process. So I wouldn't want to move ahead too quickly and not give them the opportunity to be our partners.
Just to pile on too, if there are questions for TAPE about their work, we
Yes.
could certainly receive those in writing and forward them. If there are questions about Lynch, as we understand it today, the team from Hill could certainly field those questions and we could share that back with the superintendent.
Yes. Ms. Ruby. Oh, yes. So we have two meetings, pardon me, I did not mention that. So yes, we have two meetings in the month of September, and our next meeting will be next Tuesday, September 14th, and our next meeting, and then our next meeting in September will be September 28th.
Does that work with your schedule?
And that would give us time, Mr. Nixon, to get some documents up on our website as well.
Absolutely.
Yep.
I like that idea.
Any further input from any other members on the team?
I'll just say I'm supportive of more community involvement, more accessibility, more communications. I think we should have as much input as possible before we make a decision. And can you not hear me? Just say I'm supportive of having making more of this material available on the website and having more community input if there is community input, so we can make the best decision and have the broadest support for the community.
Thank you.
I would just add that I think the 28th is probably the time that we should vote on this. That way we'll have adequate time for people to ask questions and we can answer questions, and would support that.
Okay. Thank you. And anything, Mr. Nixon?
Well, I'm just having a mental connection with our Hill team, who's just thinking in their minds just no later than that. But yeah, that will work, right? Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Could I just-
Yes.
So if we could structure it to have the conversation or some of the conversation at the next meeting, just I would hate for us to get to the 28th and then all of a sudden have some other thing that we need to, piece of information. So if we could begin the conversation and know that we're going to have the information we need to make sure we don't miss the deadline.
And can I just offer too, since the 14th is practically tomorrow in terms of business days, so if there are questions that members think that they have for Hill regarding Lynch or TAPE on their proposal, the sooner the better, to just, if you could kindly send those to the superintendent, and we can collect that and get it out to these guys. I appreciate it.
That would be great.
Okay. And so and just to summarize, what I am hearing is that we would like to take the opportunity to make sure that this is communicated with the community, and then take the opportunity to have this as our first listen in on the presentation, and a chance for us to think about this and then come back to it at a following meeting. And we will have at least some ensuing discussion at the September 14th meeting, possible vote on the 28th of September. Okay. And then with that, I would say we may move on to our next agenda item. That would conclude the presentation from TAFE. Thank you so much for everything today and for your work, as we said. And thank you to our organizations and board members and our members of the community who have been watching on WinCam. We appreciate your input and your participation. And with that, then I would say our next agenda item is an executive session for our committee, and we will need to adjourn to executive session for the purpose of discussing strategy related to collective bargaining, since to do so in open session would be detrimental to bargaining. The committee will reconvene in open session only for the purposes of adjournment.
So moved.
So, thank you very much, and we need a second. Second. And we need a roll call.
Aye.
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 Aye. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we will adjourn.